Good morning. This week we are going to be taking a look at a new section of the book, part 4 of the book, which is entitled The Disruption of American Democracy. And just like previous sections of this textbook, this part 4 introduces a range of chapters. In this case, chapters that will deal with the greatest war in American history, that being, of course, the Civil War. It's interesting because in recent weeks we have discussed the evolution of the American experiment. This experiment in freedom and democracy, or what we might call just small r, democratic republicanism. And we've seen this in a variety of forms. We've talked about the contest of ideas between, say, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. We've talked about the emergence of the National Republicans and how that led to the evolution of the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson. Of course, we have also talked about the emergence of an anti-Jackson party, the Whig Party, which had a very different philosophy in terms of how to move the country forward. And that's really the theme I would want to underscore here. We've seen a lot of developments in recent weeks about moving the country forward. The entire age of Jackson was defined by competing ideas as to how to move the country forward. We saw this obviously politically, but we also saw it from the standpoint of culture and society, as well as economics, the market revolution playing out. What we're really being introduced to in this part 4 is how these ideas about moving the country forward, this time of growth, really run into some serious obstacles. And of course the biggest obstacle being a philosophy that will develop primarily in the southern states that will call for the dissolution of the Union. And this is ironic because at a time of great expansion and growth of the country, we have this enormous obstacle that will call for the country's end, effectively, and that will be manifested through the idea of Southern secession after Lincoln is elected. And so this is the great story that we're going to be looking at over several chapters. How does the growth and the expansion of the United States, a lot of which is taking place technologically, as the book is always kind of dealing with the idea of inventing America, the technological angle, how is that undermined by a philosophy that kind of is more and more articulated in the South that calls for the Union to come to an end, which would have spelt doom for the American experiment, and was a real existential threat to the American experiment, this experiment in individual freedom and power to the people democracy. Well, let's get into the particulars, because chapter 14, while it deals with some of these overarching themes, is of course defined by the very specific history that leads us in that direction. So the first thing to consider in chapter 14 is, of course, this concept that became very, very popular in the 1840s. It was the concept of manifest destiny. It was the notion that America should expand so as to become a country that would extend from sea to shining sea. This meant westward expansion. And while the Democrats were more enthusiastic about westward expansion, there were plenty of Whigs who were interested in it too. The big question seemed to revolve around, in the 1840s, the idea of Texas. Now, Texas had acquired its independence from Mexico during the 1830s and had developed its own republic, the Lone Star Republic, as a result of that secession, you might say, or that independence from the Mexican Empire. The question became, since Texas was filled with Americans, particularly slaveholding Americans, would Texas be added to the United States? Would we seek to annex Texas? And there were a lot of folks that lined up on different sides of this question. Some were enthusiastic about the idea, particularly Southern expansionists. Others were more reticent, and not just familiar folks like, say, Henry Clay of the Whigs, who would be very cautious about expansion, knowing that it might sow the seeds of division and also lead to an advantage for the Democratic Party. Henry Clay, of course, being a Whig, but also Andrew Jackson, who, of course, by the time that the Texas controversy really started to swirl, was an ex-president, but was very cautious in his remarks on Texas, believing that perhaps the addition of Texas could lead to more problems for the United States rather than less. There was also the question of Oregon. Oregon was a jointly held territory between the United States and Great Britain, and there were a lot of folks who went out to Oregon as pioneers. It was known as Oregon Fever, of course, and we all know the familiar kind of childhood game, the Oregon Trail, speaks to this kind of enthusiasm. The question became, especially as Americans started to pour into Oregon, whether the United States should lay claim to the entire Oregon Territory, particularly the territory that extends into modern-day Canada. Of course, the British held this territory and were not interested in necessarily giving it up to the Americans. And so Oregon was a expansionist controversy as much as Texas was. And all of this comes to a head in the election of 1844. Now, the election of 1844 is a very significant one. Could have gone a lot of different directions. Essentially, you had Henry Clay, who believed that as a result of what had happened to William Henry Harrison, and of course Tyler, who had become president as a result of Harrison's death, that it was now time for a real Whig to assume the power of the presidency. Tyler was anything but a real Whig. In fact, Tyler was someone who was very much committed to the institution of slavery and its expansion, and as a result of the election of Texas, or I'm sorry, the election of 1844, will actually promote the idea that Texas should be acquired, and will actually get the ball rolling on Texas annexation, which of course Henry Clay was by and large against, although he started to waffle on this issue during the campaign. Why was Henry Clay waffling on the issue? Well, because the Democrats put up a candidate that kind of came out of nowhere, James K. Polk, who will be referred to by many as Little Hickory in an homage to Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. James K. Polk was an ardent expansionist. He really ran his campaign on the idea that we should take the entire Oregon Territory, and was also an enthusiastic supporter of the annexation of Texas. He put Henry Clay into a particular box politically, because Henry Clay had been against expansion, particularly the annexation of Texas, and Polk showed just how popular expansion was through his candidacy. Polk was a relative unknown, but because he talked about expansion and expansion was popular with the American people, he was able to gain a lot of political traction. Henry Clay, of course, found himself in a situation where he was kind of speaking against the majority of the people, and so Henry Clay started to waffle and say that maybe expansion or annexation of Texas was something that the United States could look into. This just made Henry Clay seem a little bit duplicitous, and more people rushed to support Polk. It's interesting, too, that in the election of 1844, there was a Liberty Party that really got going in American history. And of course, the Liberty Party was primarily an anti-slavery party. And we will see that essentially the Liberty Party is a forerunner of some of the free soil philosophy and later the political philosophy of the Republican Party of the 1850s. And so it's interesting to note that already we're starting to see that with the concept of national expansion to the West, we have this reemergence of the slavery issue, an issue that was supposed to be pretty much smoothed over as a result of the Missouri Compromise. Well, here it comes roaring back. Well, who won the election of 1844? It was a close call, but Polk won. And when Polk won the election of 1844, we essentially had this huge national endorsement of expansion. Now, luckily, even though Polk had threatened war with the British over Oregon, 54-40-year fight, which meant to take the whole loaf rather than the half, the British were able very quickly to settle the dispute with the incoming administration and to effectively draw the line where we recognize it today, that border of Canada and the United States out there in the Pacific Northwest. So there will be no third war with Great Britain, even though one was threatened, and the Oregon Territory will fade as a major national issue as a result of this compromise. But what's even more important is, of course, the annexation of Texas, which you will actually have Tyler push forward as a result of Polk's election. Tyler felt that it was okay to go forward with Texas annexation because, after all, the people had supported it by way of a referendum in the 1844 election. This means that by the time Polk becomes president, we are going to have a bit of an issue with Texas over the annexation of, or I should say, we're going to have a bit of an issue with Mexico over the annexation of Texas. This is going to lead to some very, very interesting stuff, and this is really what we need to focus our attention on. Polk is, of course, interested in annexing the whole of Texas. Mexico would have only allowed the United States to take a very small part of Texas by way of annexation. Polk wanted the whole big Texas. And of course, as we know, everything's big in Texas, and certainly when Americans are involved. As a result of this, there will be a clash on the border between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Polk said that Texas went all the way to the Rio Grande. The Mexicans said that it only went to the Nueces River. Mexico will basically attack American troops in that borderland between the two rivers, and Polk will claim that the United States had been invaded. This is a bit dubious, and Polk is actually denounced on the floor of the Congress by none other than Abraham Lincoln, who will ask the president to show him the spot where American blood was spilt on American soil, knowing full well that, of course, this territory was contested. Nonetheless, Polk will get his war, and the book refers to the Mexican War as Jimmy Polk's War. What's interesting is, even before the war is fought, there are a series of resolutions introduced in Congress. They're collectively known as the Wilmot Proviso. They'll be advanced several times. David Wilmot will be a congressman who will effectively put forward the idea that no slavery should come with the territories that the United States gains in the West. Now, mind you, slavery had been by and large an issue that had been silenced as a matter of national debate ever since the time of the Missouri Compromise, and certainly by the time of the 1830s, when we had the so-called gag rules, in which everybody was basically under great pressure to never bring up the issue of slavery. Abolitionists used to flood the Congress with resolutions on slavery. These were pretty much censored and made illegal in the 1830s. So you might think of it as keeping a lid on this very divisive issue. Well, what blows the lid off? You might say it's the Wilmot Proviso, in the sense that the idea of banning slavery in the Western territories that we might acquire from a war with Mexico. This really divided the Congress. Only this time, and this is the key, the Congress will not be divided according to the second party system, Whigs versus Democrats. The Congress will be divided North versus South. And that's critical, because even folks in the West will align themselves either with the North or the South when it comes time to vote. As a result of this, Southerners were able to prevent the law from going forward. And what the Wilmot Proviso really exposed was the fact that our politics was going to be defined by slavery, rather than the classical issues that we had seen with the second party system, such as tariffs, internal improvements, the bank wars. All that stuff is going by the wayside. All these politics about how to make progress in America and what the role of the federal government should be with respect to this progress, all that's going by the wayside. By the time we get to the late 40s and the early 50s, and of course throughout that decade, slavery is going to be the defining issue of our politics. And that's exactly why the Whig Party will, by the early 1850s, be no more. And we will see the development of a more thoroughgoing anti-slavery party, that is to say, the Republican Party, which also happens to be, by and large, a Northwestern party. Well, how does the war go with Mexico? Well, despite some folks who said that Mexico might be able to best the United States, the Mexican War was actually a very significant victory for the United States. It was a smashing success. It was such a success that we even occupied Mexico City, which implies that if we had wanted to take more of Mexico, we probably could have. But we had already taken quite a bit. Not only did we get Big Texas, but we also get what is known as the Mexican Cession, which includes territories such as California. Now remember, California will become a huge magnet for settlers as a result of the gold rushes in 1849. The Mexican War wraps up with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And people will begin to rush into California, particularly when there is a discovery of gold. What this will do is this will force, immediately after the Mexican War, this great conversation about what to do with these Western territories. Are we going to allow slavery, or are we not? And of course, you're going to see that folks in the South are going to be extremely pushy about the idea that slavery should be extended into the West, primarily to provide more and more protection for slavery in the South. After all, if you consider the Senate, the notion was to maintain a balance of Northern and Southern power in the Senate chamber. So even if Southerners were arguing for slavery in places in the West where slavery couldn't happen, or where slavery wasn't even economically viable, given the geography and the economy, the idea was to push for that to be a slave state so as to further buttress the power of the South, or what Lincoln will call the slaveocracy. The Mexican War is interesting also because of the technological developments. The book goes into a number of areas in which the Mexican War kind of showed some of the technology that we will later see in the Civil War. Obviously, one of the things that begins to take off around the time of the Mexican War will be the electric telegraph, which will allow for greater command and control over the battlefield. We'll also see that railroads and steamboats will be very effective in supplying troops and the actual delivery of troops to the battlefield. The telegraph, as mentioned before, provides for a greater link between, say, Washington, D.C. and the battlefield. We'll see more and more sophisticated rifles that will come about as a result of the further development of the interchangeable parts and industrial manufacture. And of course, artillery will really come to define major areas of American battle tactics. And of course, artillery will be a key component of the Civil War, as well as the rifle, in terms of making it such a lethal affair. All this was brought to bear as a result of the Mexican War. Well, we have another election, the election of 1848. And what we see in the election of 1848 is we start to see some real issues developing in terms of the political alignment. By and large, we will see that slavery will become kind of the defining feature. And the Whig Party, which will be victorious as a result of kind of nominating one of the great heroes of the war, Zachary Taylor, will try and straddle the fence on slavery. There were folks in the Whig Party that were opposed to slavery, and there were folks that were for slavery. This typically depended on whether you were from the North or the South. They were known as the Conscience Whigs if you were from the North, against slavery, and the Cotton Whigs if you were from the South and pro-slavery. The idea was that Taylor, an incredibly popular figure as a result of the war, was able to kind of corral both of these groups. But the splintering of the Whig Party is indicative of the fact that the Whig Party is really living on borrowed time. As the book rightfully points out, the election demonstrated that the old issues, banks, tariffs, internal improvements, that had dominated American politics since the 1820s no longer held center stage. The future of slavery now dominated the discussion. And that's really what we need to pull out of not only the Mexican War, but the Wilmot Proviso that preceded it, but on top of it, of course, the election of 1848, which was kind of proof positive that slavery was going to be the defining feature of our politics. This is going to spell doom for the Whig Party. It's going to pose an enormous amount of challenges for the Democratic Party. And we will see, of course, the development of an anti-slavery party, the Republican Party. And of course that means thrusting into the limelight by the end of the 1850s the man from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. And so a lot of stuff is really starting to shift here. And we will see too, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that there will be this emergence of a deeply sectional politics, particularly in the South, that will grow increasingly defensive about slavery and about protecting slavery, and will try and demand that the Congress protect slavery, that the courts protect slavery, and that the president protects slavery. And if any one of those branches wavers on this protection issue, then the South will increasingly feel the need to go its own way. And of course this will lead to the dissolution of the Union, or at least what the South thought was the dissolution of the Union. As we will see, Abraham Lincoln will not allow the Union to be dissolved, and he will make the argument that a minority of states do not have the power to destroy the Union, and that'll be the Civil War. Well, we mentioned California gold earlier. It's important to realize that folks going out to California using this new technology of mining, which became even more extractive That is to say that people started to really develop a science of how to mine minerals in the West. This will, of course, push the idea of California statehood kind of front and center. And it is California coming into the Union that will lead to this idea of a compromise for both the North and the South. This kind of ramshackle thing that will be known as the Compromise of 1850, which in the end will not fully satisfy the North and will not fully satisfy the South, and that will only spur more and more sectional tension and division within the country. Nonetheless, California is interesting not only because of the mining, but because of the people who go out there. California has always been a rather exceptional place from a population standpoint, a demographic standpoint. And one of the things that we see is a very unique blending of people who arrive in California. Not only do you have people coming from the east to California, mined for gold and other things, but on top of that we have people coming from the south who will, of course, give California a certain Hispanic or Spanish flavor as a result of originating in Mexico. And of course California was originally Mexican to begin with, and Spanish before that. On top of that, we will see that there will be incredible diversity in terms of who will be doing some of the mining, who will define some of the mine towns, including many Chinese who will come in to the United States and become a very, very important component of Western culture and Californian culture. This will create, in many ways, a very unique blend of people who are in California, but on top of it, it will exacerbate, some ethnic tensions that will continue on, essentially until the end of the century and beyond. Particularly, there will be a call at the end of the century, speaking here of the 19th century, for real restrictions on Chinese immigration. And the Chinese remain really the only group that were truly singled out by way of national legislation to exclude them from coming into the United States. Certainly not a hallmark of tolerance, but instead a real indicator of intolerance in the American experience. Well, rather than get into some of the issues that, of course, will occupy our attention after the Civil War, let's talk about, the history that really leads to the Civil War. And one of the things that absolutely has to be understood is the Compromise of 1850. Now, as stated previously, it is California and the idea of California coming in as a free state that will really push legislation to the center stage in terms of how are we going to deal not only with the admission of California as a free state, but also other Western territories. And as a result of this controversy, what to do about the West? Should slavery be allowed to be extended into the West? If so, how does that work? We will get essentially Henry Clay working in the Congress with others to essentially hammer out a compromise. And this compromise was an attempt to satisfy the northern interests and to satisfy the southern interests. But of course, because some of its provisions are so controversial and so divisive, the idea of the Compromise of 1850 being a real compromise is terribly misleading. If anything, it stokes the fire of sectional discord, of this new feeling that there was real division in the country. And that's not good, because it generates this defensiveness in the South, in which they will look for every national political opportunity as one that could provide greater and greater protection for slavery, not only in the West but in the South. And then, of course, you will have this northern sentiment that will break along a couple of lines. One will be this free soil ideology, that the West should be kept free, in the sense that there would be no importation of African American slaves into the West, and that the West would remain essentially this place where you could have white homesteaders developing the future of America. Abraham Lincoln will be very much a free soiler. There is this other group, and a lot of people say that Lincoln during the time of the Civil War will join them, but it's the abolitionists. But we hear a lot about the abolitionists, but the abolitionists were always a very distinct minority. And of course they were looking to not just keep slavery out of the West, as the free soilers were, but to eliminate slavery altogether, to abolish it. So when you look at the Compromise of 1850, you have to really look at it from three perspectives. You have to look at it from a Southern slaveholding perspective. You have to look at it from a free soil Western perspective. And you also have to look at it from a Northern abolitionist perspective. And when you do that, you begin to see that the provisions of the Compromise of 1850 are wholly inadequate to satisfying those interests. And they're just going to be looking for more in the 1850s, particularly the South. They're just going to be relentless in feeling that they have to extend slavery into the West, that they have to guarantee slavery's survival for all time. And this will produce a certain radicalism that will eventually, spill over into secession. And that's important to understand. These radical Southern politicians were known as fire eaters, and while they remain a minority, they will eventually gain more and more traction and push the Southern states, to basically go it alone by the time of Lincoln's election. All right, rather than continue to go on and on about the significance of the Compromise of 1850, let's just make sure that we go through the provisions as the book does. California would be a free state. There would be, in the Mexican cession, the use of popular sovereignty, the idea that the residents of the various territories would be allowed to decide for themselves on the future of slavery. They'd be able to vote on it, which sounded like a democratic solution, but what it really meant was who can get people into those areas faster than the other. Can the North or the South, can they send people into these areas so as to, basically gin up the vote to make sure that it was a free or slave state? This will lead to open warfare in some cases, not necessarily in the Mexican cession, but later on when we see the principle of popular sovereignty applied to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The borders were settled between New Mexico and Texas. The government assumed Texas's pre-annexation debt. And then here's another one, that slavery would be abolished in the District of Columbia, which of course was supposed to be something that the North wanted. But essentially, you would have no disruption of or interference with Southern slavery and the slave trade that existed within the South. That was another provision. And here was the thing that really sent people over the moon, particularly in the abolitionist North. And that is, of course, the new Fugitive Slave Act, a very strong act to ensure that if slaves ran away from the South, that the South had the ability, under federal authority to go up and to reclaim those slaves, which in some cases meant that slaves would be seized, or I should say, free African Americans would be seized and would be put into slavery. Because obviously, there wasn't much in terms of checks or balances on ensuring that an African American in the North was indeed a runaway Southern slave. And so there were folks that were quite literally sold down the river, as the expression was, and sold into slavery. Just terrible, awful stuff. This will lead to a lot of folks in the South celebrating aspects of the Compromise of 1850, but of course folks in the North suggesting that it was a disaster in many ways, particularly over the Fugitive Slave Act. In Boston, there will actually be the introduction of what is known as personal liberty laws. Boston citizens will refuse to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law, and this will occur in other areas of Massachusetts as well. And of course, that just stokes Southern anger that they wouldn't abide by the terms of the Compromise of 1850. Ultimately, what we had was, with the Compromise of 1850, we also had, a tradition of political leaders kind of passing from the scene. Daniel Webster of the North, Henry Clay, quote unquote, of the West, Kentucky, not so much West anymore, John C. Calhoun, of course, of South Carolina and the South. These guys are going to die out shortly after the Compromise of 1850. And so the generation that really helped to lead and direct America in the wake of the War of 1812, they're gone. And now we enter this kind of brave new world of the 1850s, where in many ways, as a result of the Compromise of 1850 and other legislation, the Missouri Compromise is going to be wiped clean. The politics is going to be defined by slavery instead of the old issues of tariffs, internal improvements, banks. And we will have new figures who will arise, some of whom will be, kind of within the political mainstream, others of which will be well outside of the political mainstream. And they will be kind of ratcheting up the tension and creating really a crisis mood in America, a crisis mood that just doesn't seem to fade away, and will actually serve the interests of the ultimate obstructionists, the fire eaters of the South, these rabid kind of Southern secessionists, who will increasingly be able to make the argument that slavery will not be given the protection it deserves, and therefore the slave holding regions, the slave holding states, should secede from the Union. And of course, this will produce the worst war in American history, the Civil War. Next time we'll be looking at this very divisive time of the 1850s, and how essentially slave politics dominated everything, and that led to a situation where, in many ways, there was a certain point of no return in terms of the Civil War coming to America. Thank you, and have a good day.